events of recent months in Belarus have changed attitudes towards certain pieces of music very significantly. Some works that used to be unknown suddenly became popular, and those that used to have one context suddenly acquired a completely new one. One of such pieces is perhaps the most popular spiritual hymn of Belarus, the choir Almighty God, or in Belarusian Mahutny Boža. I would like to tell a little about the history of this choir, which is perhaps not as well known to the wider public as its recent performances. If you would like to hear a recording of this piece, you can find it in another video on my channel. Let's start with the text and its creator, the poet Natalla Hardziyenka. Her geography of life has been very broad from the beginning. The daughter of a Russian employer, she was born in Baku, grew up in Vilnius and was evacuated to Yaroslavl during the First World War. After marrying a Polish officer, she lived for a time in Poland, whose territory, like that of Belarus, changed regularly during the many wars of those decades. In 1942, in Nazi-occupied Minsk, Hardziyenka wrote a poem entitled Prayer, the text of which begins with the words "Mighty God, Lord of the Universes." Presumably it was commissioned for the Council of the Belarusian Orthodox Church. This poem was first published in the autumn of 1943 in the Belarusian newspaper, the nationalist Belarus language periodical that was controlled by the German authorities in whose editorial office Hardziyenka worked. In 1944, Soviet troops began an operation to liberate Minsk. The return of Soviet government on the one hand meant the liberation of the city from Nazi forces and the horrors of war. But it also meant the return of the Soviet ideology, which before the war had systematically suppressed the Belarusians' interest in their national culture and language. In addition, the loyalty to the Nazis during the 3 years of the occupation could become a reason for later repressions. Therefore, some of the Belarusian intellectuals who had survived the Soviet repression of the 1930s and the German occupation of the 1940s decided not to expose themselves again to the next change of power. So they emigrated before the return of Soviet troops. Thus, at the end of June 1944, Hardziyenka evacuated first to Poland and then to Germany. Around the same time, the composer and conductor Mykola Rawinski emigrated to Germany along with other cultural figures. In recent years, he has suffered greatly from both Soviet and German regimes. His brother, Anton, was executed by the Soviet authorities before the war, and Mykola himself was dismissed from the Union of Composers because of his unreliable kinship. Later, the events of the war separated him from his family, and German soldiers murdered one of Rawinski's daughters and his second brother, Alexander. Among other things, the atheist ideology of the USSR was an additional danger to the composer, who worked for many years as a choir leader in various churches in Belarus and wrote religious music. He and other Belarusians ended up in Bavaria, which became a part of the American sector after the war. Both Hardziyenka and Rawinski lived for several years in so-called camps for displaced persons. Camps linked to them both, the poet and the composer, were located in places such as Amberg, Osterhofen, Michelsdorf and Windischberger Dorf, both near Cham, Regensburg and Rosenheim. Hundreds of thousands of people of different nationalities lived in camps for displaced persons in Bavaria. For example, some people know that the Gankhofer Siedlung in Regensburg between 1945-49 was called Little Ukraine, because up to 5,000 displaced Ukrainians lived there, who later contributed to the formation of the Ukrainian diaspora in Bavaria. But not many people know that at the same time there was a large number of Belarusians living there, who were, however, soon transferred to other camps. In Regensburg they even set up a Belarusian gymnasium to teach their children. It was named after Janka Kupala, the iconic Belarusian poet who had died a few years before. The gymnasium moved to different camps in Bavaria along with the Belarusians themselves. At the gymnasium, presumably at the same time in the school year 1945-46, Arseniyeva taught foreign languages while Ravinsky taught singing and conducted the local choir. They probably met there, although we don't know any evidence of their communication either before emigration or during their stay in the camps. In any case, when Ravinsky was first commissioned to write music for a Belarusian patriotic prayer for the church choir, he was not even aware that the text of this prayer was a modified text of Arseniyeva's 1942 poem. As he discovered the original, he decided to rewrite the music into the author's initial text. Thus, a musical hymn was added to the poetic prayer. It was first performed in autumn 1947 in Osterhofen, when a week of prayers for Belarus was held there, with ecumenical service uniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches. So, from the very beginning, during the difficult time of separation, this work became a symbol of unity, both of different confessions and Belarusians abroad and in the homeland. The same autumn, Mahutny Boža was printed in Paris, but it did not reach Belarus for a long time, most probably until the end of the 80s, when the crumbling Iron Curtain permitted the restoration of contacts with the Belarusians abroad. In Belarus, the hymn quickly became popular and began to be performed regularly in churches and concert halls. In 1993, an international festival of sacred music named after the hymn was established in Mahutny. Neither Arseniyeva nor Ravinsky ever returned to Soviet Belarus. In 1950, when the camps in Bavaria began to close, Arseniyeva moved to the USA and Ravinsky to Belgium, where he worked at the University of Leuven and died just a few years later. Thus, during the destructive war, change of political regimes, murders, arrests and displacements, two Belarusians created a work which was outside the ideological interpretation of events, but which became a strong artistic act, expressing pain, hope and faith, which has been empowering and inspiring Belarusians for over 70 years. Symbolically, in August 2020, this particular anthem became one of the most popular pieces sung by civilians to protest against the immense violence that has filled the streets and prisons of Belarus. In just a few weeks, this anthem was sung dozens of times by the Volny Chor, the choir which has become in Belarus the symbol of the musical partisan struggle. Mahutny Boža still corresponds to the original title of the poem, prayer. It is a prayer for a Belarus that will not experience the kind of suffering its inhabitants had to endure in the 1930s, 40s and 2020s.